Hello, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Tyler Liggett, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available shortly on YouTube. You can also access videos of past programming on our YouTube. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop hearing system or at any time during the program have difficulty hearing, please contact one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker will come to you with a microphone. If you are a part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones, please. Now please join me in welcoming Senior Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you very much, and I hope you can appreciate our student always giving a welcome as well. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and the 2023 Dole Lecture. Before introducing tonight's distinguished guests, we would like to announce the recipients of two special Dole Institute awards. Our first award is the annual Robert J. Dole Service to Country Award, and it provides a $1,000 award. This award was established by John D. Pinniger, Douglas E. Smith, and Pinniger Smith and Associates. And each year, it is awarded to a student at the University of Kansas who is an active member of the Dole Institute Advisory Board. This student must show commitment to public service and demonstrate leadership qualities through their involvement at the Dole Institute Advisory Board and the KU community. I would like to ask Cass Casmus to stand, please, and face the audience. Thank you. The recipient of the 2023 Robert J. Dole Service to Country Award is Cass Casmus. The committee recognizes Cass for her remarkable leadership experience. The committee is impressed by her dedication and duty to our country and is exemplified by her military service. Cass currently trains cadets as a color guard officer in the Army ROTC. We are also proud that she has been involved in the KU community, including serving as a vice chair of the Student Rights Committee in the KU Student Senate and being a voice for military students. We're delighted about her increased involvement in the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board this past year. And I can tell you she has been involved, including being hired as our next Pizza and Politics coordinator starting this fall. Her parents, Samuel and Vicki Casmus, could not be here this evening, but I always like to recognize parents because I know if they were, they would be very proud of their student, their daughter, this afternoon. So would you please give Casmus? Thank you, Cass. You can be seated. The Elizabeth Dole Award, Student Service Award, also provides a $1,000 award. and it's by John D. Pinniger, Douglas E. Pinniger, and Kathleen N. Smith to provide a $1,000 award each year to a student at the University of Kansas who is active member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. This student must demonstrate commitment to public service and civic engagement and embrace opportunities to bridge education with future goals. The recipient of this 2023 Elizabeth Dole Public Service Award is Olivia Lara. Lara, would you stand and face the crowd? The committee recognizes Olivia Lara for being an incredible example of a student committed to public service and civic engagement, in her case, driven by her passion for politics and aspirations in the field of law. She has served in a number of leadership positions, including treasurer and team captain for KU's mock trial team, and is sophomore representative in the KU Student Senate. She is also a frequent volunteer at the Dole Institute events and was president of her high school debate team. Would her mother, Melissa Woody, please stand and be recognized? Now I'm going to ask you to stand again because I want Cass to stand with you, the two of you, so you can get your photo taken, and then you can give them a rousing round of applause. Thank you very much and congratulations. Now, tonight's program is presented in partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center and Sunflower Foundation. Could our partners at the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Sunflower Foundation please stand and be recognized? Thank you. We are excited that C-SPAN will be broadcasting this evening's program. Now, this evening's program, the Dole Lecture, is held yearly in the spring and commemorates the date when Bob Dole was critically wounded while serving in Italy during World War II. The Dole Lecture honors Dole's courageous recovery and commitment to serve the nation. Tonight's interview will be conducted by Dole Institute Director Audrey Coleman. And our special guests, as you know this evening, are Senators Tom Daschle and Senator Trent Lott, who, like Senator Dole, each served as Senate Majority Leader. I'd like to read a special message for tonight's guests, and I'll have you know I read it at dinner so they get to hear it twice. And it was written by Senator Elizabeth Dole, and it's to the guests, all of you, and our two special guests of the 2023 Dole Lecture. Thank you for coming together in the spirit of my beloved late husband, Bob Dole. The Dole Lecture has become an annual highlight of the Dole Institute's mission to promote political and civic participation with a commitment to civility and bipartisanship. I truly regret not being able to attend this year, especially as I can think of few leaders as qualified to advance those virtues as Senators Trent Lott and Tom Daschle. At a time when our national unity feels fragile, we often mistake political deal-making for partisanship. Yet true partisanship is rooted in servant leadership, the ideal that leaders in our democracy are, first and foremost, public servants. Leaders who embrace this approach are the most effective representatives of their constituents and the greatest problem solvers of our nation. We certainly see that in the legacies of tonight's special guest. Senator Lott represented the people of Mississippi in Congress for 35 years. He built bridges across the political aisle in support of important initiatives, including President Reagan's Economic Recovery Program. Senator Lott was elected as Republican whip in both the House and the Senate, the first member of Congress to earn both titles. In those roles, he became a close and trusted colleague of Bob's, and later succeeded Bob as Senator Majority Leader. Senator Daschle's accomplished career in Congress spanned more than 2.5 decades. In that time, he was elected as the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate. Through his legislative achievements, including compensation for disabled veterans, Senator Daschle found common ground with Bob that not only solidified their relationship as colleagues, but as friends. Together, they went on to establish the Bipartisan Policy Center, later joined by Senator Lott, to continue promoting the ideals of cooperation and civility. I am deeply grateful to the senators for their friendship and outstanding public service over these many decades, and I thank them for taking part in this special night. With my warmest wishes, Elizabeth Dole. It is my pleasure to present Senator Tom Daschle and Senator Trent Lott. Please give them a warm Jayhawk welcome.
Senator Lott, Senator Daschle, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been so fun getting to spend time with you these last couple of days.
Great to be with you, Audrey, and great to be with my dear friend Trent Lott.
Well, thank you, Audrey. It's really been a pleasure, and you've done a great job. And congratulations to the student winners tonight.
Absolutely. And thank you both.
Two very talented young ladies, and I expect to see you in Washington someday. But this has been a great program, and we're just delighted to be here and be a part of it with you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, we were just chatting just before the program how this is, you both appear together quite frequently, and we're giving you an opportunity that you haven't had in a few months, so we're really proud of that.
Well, we use each other's lines a lot. Oftentimes give each other credit, but it's been a little while since we've had a chance to have a reunion like this, so we've been looking forward to it.
Well, I tell that one Senate prerogative is you can use your colleagues' good quotes without any attribution. So when I quote Tom Daschle of saying the most important leadership tool is your ears, I don't quote him. I just let that be my term. He also says that the biggest problem in Washington now is the airplane, because everybody's trying to figure out how late can I come in and how soon can I leave, which is so true. But it's a pleasure to be here with Tom. Not only did we serve as majority and majority leaders, each one of us, we became good friends. And our wives and we get together and we have a great relationship. I hope that we can see that sort of relationship develop with our leaders in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're talking about stealing each other's lines. I can only imagine the process that you both went to when you were co-authoring your 2016 book, Crisis Point. You know, which line was attributed to which person?
You know, it was really a great project. We came up with the idea a few years ago. Trent came to, we have a home in South Carolina, and Trent and Tricia came, and we started working through just how we would put it together, and then really just over about a year, we really worked on putting it all together, and it came, and then we did a long book tour across the whole country, and it was just a terrific project. What I keep thinking is we ought to write a second volume, given all the things that we've been, maybe Crisis Point 2.0 right now, but it was a terrific project, and I enjoyed it immensely.
Well, I remember when that was suggested. We were having a glass of wine at a fireplace in South Carolina, and Tom made the suggestion we do this book, and I thought it was a good idea. But actually, I was there trying to teach Tom how to be a Southerner. And when I first told him that, he said, "Hey, South Dakota." I said, "No, that's not going to work." So I took a hammock as a gift to he and his wife, Linda, and then I had to teach him how to get in the hammock with your wife without turning over.
And we use it all the time, and think of Trent and Tricia every time we fall out.
But our book, Crisis Point, we made a point of saying that this was not really about us and not wanting to be in the stands, say, look how we did it, But we did say that we went through some difficult times together, and Tom and I enumerate the things that we did together, including 9/11, the anthrax attack on the Capitol, including his office, the 50-50 Senate, and how we got things together. So we learned during that process that there are three key components to leadership, particularly bipartisan leadership. Number one is communication. You know, in life, with your family, in your neighborhood, whatever you do, if you're not talking, you're really not learning. And we talk to each other regularly, and it made a huge difference. The other thing that they sort of lost in Washington now is camaraderie, just knowing each other. I used to have spousal dinners. Tom remembers this, and I had bagpipers play, and I had Senator Bill Cohen do an ode to the ladies of the Senate, and I always would put a liberal Democrat next to a conservative Republican and their spouses. So I had Ted Kennedy and his wife next to Orrin Hatch and his wife. But the message is, when you've had dinner with somebody and their spouse, you're a lot less likely to put a knife in their ribs the next day. But just having a relationship. And the other thing that we really, really need is leadership, like we had from Bob Dole. What a great personality, what a great leader. We all respected him so much because of who he was. I described him earlier today as a patriot statesman. He was both. We need more of that. And that's why Tom and I do events like this together.
So Senator Elizabeth mentioned, of course, and we know that you have the connection, both of you, with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Senator Daschle, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to co-found that organization with Senator Bob Dole and others.
Well, Bob and I talked about doing it when I left the Senate in 2005. Bob was one of the very first people to suggest that maybe we could continue to find ways to work together. He was the first Republican leader I worked with for the first 2 years that I served as leader, and then Bob left the Senate to run for president, which these days is almost unheard of. Most people would just stay in the Senate and run regardless, but Bob thought so much of the Senate and the institution that he felt you couldn't do both well. You had to do one or the other. And so he left and ran for president, and I'll never forget the day he left. It was a very emotional time for me. We got to be very close. When I became leader, it was amazing. He reached out to me in so many ways and really set the bar for me as a leader to try to achieve aspirationally what Bob Dole had done while he had been leader. So when I left the Senate, he had already, of course, left. And he invited me to join him, and I joined him at his law firm and played Alston and Bird, the law firm. And one day we were talking with a mutual friend of Bob's and mine, Jason Grimay, and the whole idea, even back then, was we were increasingly concerned about the direction the country was going, how polarized it was, how confrontational, and we thought that really there has to be a way. Not only to create an environment for people to talk, but to be the convener and to advocate for legislation. Bob was a partisan and I was a partisan. Trent is a partisan. But we also know that at the end of the day, I've said this a million times, compromise is the oxygen of democracy. And compromise is so necessary in the legislative process. And Bob understood that. And so Bob and I and George Mitchell and Howard Baker talked a little bit more about what kind of a center we could have. And Bill Hoagland and his entire staff are here tonight on a lot of the health staff that we have at the BPC. And it's a perfect example of what it is to find the common ground when, as you know, health can be very divisive. It can be very confrontational. But through the BPC and through Bill and Marilyn and all the others who have worked on it, we've really been able to find opportunities for that common ground. That was Bob Dole's aspiration. Bob Dole set the bar, and we all tried to live up to it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned, you owned your partisanship, because I think sometimes people think when you're asking people to be bipartisan, you're asking them to not have a perspective or maybe relinquish some of what they believe, their principles. But I want to ask each of you to go back to your earliest career and when you decided to become a partisan, and how did you decide which team, I guess, to sign up with, and what inspired you to get involved in politics?
Well, as I look back on it, growing up in my home state of Mississippi, a poor state with a lot of needs, both of my grandparents were Democrat elected officials, and my uncle, World War II veteran, was a state senator. I was actually 21 years old before I met my first live Republican. I was a senior at Ole Miss, and this guy came up to me on the street, and he said, hey, Trent, we're forming a new group on the campus. We think maybe you kind of guy might want to join. I said, what's that? He said, College Republicans. I said, you got to be kidding. I'm not joining a group like that. But I graduated from undergraduate school and law school, went back to my hometown, started practicing law, had a baby. Everything's going good, singing in the church choir, and that's where I plan to spend the rest of my life. And then I got involved in the gubernatorial campaign, and when he came to my hometown of Pascagoula, Mississippi, a shipbuilding community, at the beach park, I was asked to introduce him. And so I did, and he got elected governor, but I met the local congressman, a Democrat who had been serving in Congress for 36 years. It was a nice visit. I never thought much more about it, but 2 months later he called me and said, my chief of staff for 32 years is retiring, and I wondered if you'd be interested in coming to Washington. So I went to work when I was 26 years old in 1968. In Washington for a lifelong Democrat, chairman of the Rules Committee. It was an interesting learning experience. I learned so much from him. 4 years later, he said, I'm going to retire. And 2 weeks later, I went to him and said, I'm going to run to try to succeed you. I can't replace you, and I think you know by now, I'm going to have to run as a Republican. And he said, well, and he took a puff of his cheap cigar, a sip of his cheap old granddad bourbon. And he said, well, I admire your courage, but I fear you're embarking on a hopeless crusade. And my heart sank, but I said, well, my wife and I just believe this is the way we got to do it. He said, okay, when you go out that door, you go home and campaign. Don't come back till it's over. 2 weeks before the general election, he endorsed me. 2 weeks after the election, he called me and said, hey, why don't you come back and go on my staff in Washington and help me close my office? As his Republican successor, I went back on his payroll, the chairman of the Rules Committee, and closed his office. There are a lot of stories in that. One of them is, could that happen today? But that's kind of my background. I grew up not knowing about party politics. I learned by going to Washington. It was a great ride. But I still feel like, as Madison said, it's more important than the parties. It really is about doing what's right for your country.
In my case, I had, besides my parents, who were by far the most influential two people in my life, were so responsible for the fact that I'm here tonight. I had some wonderful teachers that really impacted me. There was one in particular. I was born and raised a Catholic and went to a parochial school for 9 years. My first grade teacher was a woman whose name was Sister Morris Crowley. She was a big woman, and she had a sense of humor like you wouldn't believe. She said she always wanted to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, and God made her a basilica instead. We made it. Every election day, for all the way until she passed away, we'd come to her convent and spend a little time with her. She'd say a little prayer. I'll never forget the year I was running for the Senate. We came, my wife and I. It was just a ritual. Every time, and so this time we came, and she said, "I did something special this year. You know, I usually have a statue of Jesus and a statue of Mary on my counter." And she said, "Look at that. Mary's gone." He said, "I put Mary in the drawer, and I told Jesus, if you ever want to see your mother again, you better see that Tom Daschle gets elected to the Senate."
I didn't have that kind of
So I had no choice. But as a young Catholic boy, John Kennedy really inspired many of us. I remember we brought a little black and white television in to watch his inaugural. And it so inspired me, this young, handsome president with a beautiful wife, and just caught my imagination. And it wasn't long after that, I really developed just a real interest in history. And that interest in history led to an interest in public policy, and history especially around the American Revolution in those early days. And the stories of our founding fathers. I can remember literally reading every biography about every president. I belonged to as a book club for young students, where about every third month or so, you got a new book, a new biography of the president. I read them all, and I read several of them many times. But that is really what started that inspiration that we got from those books, my fascination with history, and teachers like Sister Morris Crowley.
That's wonderful. That was a great story. Thank you. Senator Lott, I wanted to follow up and ask you, you mentioned last night a couple of Republicans that you came to admire when you were working in Washington in those fairly early days. Would you tell the audience who those folks were? You mentioned President Ford.
Well, I'm not quite sure who I might have said, but, you know, I was a fan of Jerry Ford. When I was working with Congressman Calmer, he was one of the leaders in the House, and I admired him. Jack Kemp was a young, dynamic, rising star from congressman, former football player from New York. I used to tell him I spent more time on the football field as a cheerleader than he did as quarterback. He never liked that too much, but I was inspired by, and I was inspired by Bob Dole. He was a unique character, and I was talking about it earlier today. Before Elizabeth started dating Bob Dole, she dated Sonny Montgomery of Mississippi, and I was really pulling for Sonny to reel her in, and then Bob just swept her off her feet, and off she went. But I've worked with both sides as a staff member and as a member of Congress, and there are a lot of good men and women that do a great job for our country, and I don't think we give them enough credit for the challenges they face. And you take a guy like Bob Dole with the physical issues he had to deal with. What a great man. And now to have this institute. I congratulate all of you that are associated with this, the student advisor group, or those of you that support it financially. That this hopefully will inspire more young people to follow the example that Bob Dole set.
Thank you. You both served several terms, both in the House and in the Senate. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in the dynamics between the House and the Senate as you experienced it? I'm sure you could write a couple of books on that, but if there's an example or two you might be able to share that kind of illuminates that difference.
Well, I think obviously one of the first differences you realize right out of the box is the numbers. I mean, the numbers really create the environment. 435 House members, 100 U.S. senators. In the House, I never got as high in my leadership ranks as Trent did with him, but I was in leadership in the House as well. And it's much more majority driven. Majorityism is a part of the House. It's the majority that really dictates virtually every aspect of the legislative agenda, and the minority really doesn't have the kind of role that I wish it did, frankly. I wish there was more of an opportunity. Occasionally you get bipartisan legislation, and I wish we'd see a lot more of that. In the Senate, there's more of a tradition of bipartisanship, in part because of the filibuster, but it's always been that way as well. I think there's more camaraderie, there is more, you have assigned desks in the Senate. They're handed down from one senator to the next, and you have a tradition of carving your name into that drawer. You pull open the drawer and you see the names of all these senators who have served before you, and there's a recognition of history when you sit at that awesome desk. And so it's partially the environment, it's partially the rules, but a big part of it is the numbers.
I have really enjoyed the House. I was in the House 16 years, 8 years as whip. during the 8 years of Reagan, and that was really a fun thing. And one of the things that he did that we need to get back to, he met with the leadership of the Congress weekly at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, quite often bipartisan, sometimes just Republicans. But we'd go in and meet with him, and he would listen to us, and we would listen to him. I remember one time I was sitting next to him, and we were discussing monetary policy. We had Republicans and Democrats. It was pretty boring. And I noticed that Reagan is doodling. He's drawing a cowboy on a horse. He's a pretty good little artist, and he had a cowboy with a hat on. And I'm thinking, oh, Lord, he's not even listening. And then all of a sudden, he tore the page off, turned it over, drew 2 lines, and he said, here's the problem. We need our monetary policy to be in these lines, not over or under. He summed it up with that one little phrase. He was listening. So I asked him after over if he would autograph that. I have that page till this day, and I framed it where you can see the front and the back. But I love the House, but you know, it's like an anthill, a lot of activity. You know, I was always in the minority for 16 years, never was in the majority. Tom is right. The majority in the House runs the place. The Senate was a completely different place, obviously. I had the great honor of being whip and leader, and it was, you know, it was a great honor. It was also a lot harder. I wrote a book about it called Herding Cats. You ever try to herd cats? I don't know if y'all know this or not, but cats are Republicans. Did y'all know that? And dogs are Democrats. And there's a reason why I would say that, but I won't go into that for now. In the Senate, if you're the majority leader, as Tom and I both were, I mean, you're running the place. You decide what comes to the floor of the Senate, how long it can be debated. You even can, if you really want to, you can control amendments. So they're very different institutions. But when I look back on it, you know, my mother was a school teacher. My dad was a shipyard pipe fitter union member from Pascagoula, Mississippi. And I was able to live the American dream and serve in the House and the Senate. It was quite a ride. And I just hope that Tom and I, anything we can do to encourage young people, like these young people, people in the Dole Institute, hey, this thing is worth preserving. It really is special. And we need to pay more attention to how we get men and women, young and old, to come together to do what's right for our country. Just like right now, some of my colleagues in the Congress don't like to hear it, but I've been saying to them on this debt ceiling, just do it. You're going to have to do it. Why wait till the last minute when it's going to cause financial problems? Get it over with, and then sit down and work on the budget. One of the things Tom and I can talk about, when Clinton was president and Republicans had the House and the Senate, guess what? We went through a long, protracted negotiation.
Weeks and weeks.
But we came to an agreement on a balanced budget for 4 years and a surplus. It hadn't happened since 1969, and as we would say in Mississippi, it ain't happened since. It can be done, but it takes men and women of determination and goodwill to make it happen.
And Trent's reference to the ears earlier is something that we both really believe in. I use an expression that well, we both use it, I guess, that the best way to persuade is with your ears. That is, you've got to be a good listener. And sometimes politicians forget the listening part. It's easy to speak. It's a little harder to listen. And I think, and that's one of Trent's great strengths. He is an amazing listener. And he not only listens, but he acts on what he hears. And that really makes him the kind of leader he's been. But we don't see the kind of listening going on in Washington tonight that I wish we did.
When each of you arrived in the Senate in the late 80s and Senator Bob Dole was the Republican leader in the minority, what were some of your first experiences working with him?
Well, Bob and I served on 2 committees together, Agriculture and Finance. So we really spent a lot of time on agriculture in particular. We were talking with the students this afternoon, and one of the questions was, what was some of the things you worked on with Bob? Many of you are old enough to remember the farm crisis of the 1980s and how bad it was. a credit crisis that drove many farmers and ranchers to bankruptcy. We lost a ton of people going to auctions all the time, and I'll never forget how tough it was. And Bob was, I'm pretty sure at that time he was the chairman of the Agriculture Committee. He was either chairman or the second ranking Republican. But we worked on a whole farm program and a farm agenda together. And it made a huge difference. We finally pulled agriculture out of the red, and they began making a living again for a while. And it's always tough in agriculture. Farmers are always having to deal with the uncertainties of weather and crops. But Bob was an extraordinary leader, and he was a man who rolled up his sleeves and really put a lot of effort. Then the other thing we worked on together was the whole notion that farmers could not only be the producers of food, feed, and fiber, but fuel as well. And we worked on ethanol legislation together and actually passed the Dole-Daschle Amendment in 1990 to the Clean Air Act, which for the first time outlawed lead. And instead of lead, authorized public policy to include alternative fuels like ethanol. And it's been a huge multi-billion-dollar industry for agriculture ever since. But Bob Dole was one of the initiators of that whole effort, and I was very proud to work with him on it.
Well, I've watched Bob Dole and enjoyed watching him. One of his nicknames was the sheriff, because he was always kind of patrolling the back rail of the Senate, watching what was going on and who was about to jump ship on him. So he was called the sheriff, and also one nickname was Dirty Harry, because his attitude is make my day. But there was a sweet side to Bob. His relationship, and I mentioned this last night to Audra, his relationship with the senator from Hawaii, Danny Inouye, that he was also wounded in World War II. They were such great friends, Democrat and Republican, but they had fought for their country and have paid a very severe price. One other story about the man Dole. When I was whip, before he left, I was the whip of the vote counter for Dole. We were having a vote on a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. And one of the leaders, by the way, was a Democrat. It was Dorgan, wasn't it, from North Dakota. Yeah. And so I was working, counting votes, trying to get votes. Finally, I realized it was down to one vote. So I went in to see Bob in the leader's office. I said, Bob, it's down to one vote. If we get if we get Mark Hatfield of Oregon, we'll win by one. If we don't, we're going to lose. He said, well, get him in here. So I went out to the floor of the Senate, found Mark Hatfield, took him in to see Bob Dole. I stayed out in a little receiving office, and he went in there, and they were gone for about 20 minutes. And I'm thinking, oh, boy, this is good. So Hatfield comes out, and he's looking very pale, and he walks right past me. He didn't speak. He went out the door. So I'm wondering, well, what happened? So a few minutes later, Bob comes out, and I don't know if y'all ever seen Bob doing this, but he was just real loose. He was whistling. And so I said, did you get his vote? He said, no, but he did offer to resign. If he had resigned, we would have won by one vote. And if he didn't, we were going to lose by one vote. So I said, did you take his resignation? He said, as you would expect from Bob Dole, no, of course not. A man of principle cannot be mistreated. We had to vote. We lost it by one vote. That was a big issue. That was an important issue for our country, a balanced budget constitutional amendment. But we lost it by one vote because Bob did the right thing on a personal basis.
Bob and I, when I became leader, I was telling a group earlier this afternoon, he always insisted on coming to my office. And I said, well, Bob, I'm the junior leader. You're the senior leader. You know, I ought to be coming to your office with my staff. And he says, no, the advantage of me coming to your office is I know when the meeting's over. But Bob and I used to share stories, and I'll never forget, he always had about 10 to my 1. But we shared a story that I used to love to tell, and I used to give him credit now and then, but we both talk about one day we were at a big farm gathering, and hundreds of people out there, and I stood up on on a trailer and started talking with a microphone, and people started gathering around and started listening to what I had to say. And the more I talked, the more they gathered. But then, like most politicians, I began talking way, way too long, and that crowd just started dissipating to the point where there were just two people in their, I looked like late 80s, early 90s, standing right in front of me. So I jumped down and I said, I want to thank you for listening to my entire speech. Would you mind telling me which part of it you like the best? They said, none of it. That's our wagon you're standing on.
Did you make that up?
No, that's a Bob Dole story.
You got to watch him now. He embellishes his stories sometimes.
Well, Senator Daschle, you mentioned the successes of the balanced budget and the budget surplus during that era. What, for each of you, were there a piece of policy or legislation that didn't pass, that you couldn't find common ground on? Anything that comes to mind, intractable?
That we couldn't find common ground?
Yeah, that either of you, or just in general a disappointment maybe that you would have had that was really close and didn't.
Oh, that was close.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, Trent mentioned the balanced budget. We had to deal with several constitutional amendments. There was a flag burning amendment. Yeah. There was a balanced budget amendment. There was a marriage amendment, constitutional amendment that really were divisive, and for which it was pretty hard to find the common ground. We on the marriage amendment, we ultimately passed some statutory language. Not a constitutional amendment. I'm not sure. I think we may have done the same thing on a flag burning amendment, but there were a lot of those kinds of issues that were just a lot of pressure to keep our position, and the resistance to finding common ground was prevalent all the way through the debate.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, when Tom and I were working on these things together, we got them done. When we had the 50-50 Senate, I like to tell the story, 50-50, we were able to pass the defense bill, the National Defense Act. We passed Nancy Kassenbaum's portability of insurance. I believe it was during that same period. We passed No Child Left Behind.
Right.
We passed every appropriations bill.
Created the Department of Homeland Security.
And this is when it was equally divided. But in a way, it kind of gave us an extra incentive to get it done, to show that we could get it done, even though we were 50-50.
We both got into a lot of trouble when,
oh, yeah.
When you have a 50-50 Senate, there's no majority. And so how do you figure out who's going to be the majority in the committees, and how are you going to organize the Senate when there's no real majority? And Trent got into more trouble than I did,
Yeah,
but we both got into
leadership
trouble.
position.
But because we finally found a way to compromise on all of this, and we took it back to our caucuses, and Trent called me and said, "Are you in as much trouble as I am in this thing?" And he just about lost his job on that.
They felt like I'd given Tom too much, and I was really catching hell from my conference. We were meeting over in the Library of Congress, and I was sitting there thinking, I'm going to have to resign because of basically a no confidence vote. And then there's a Kansas angle to this. As it was really getting hot, Pat Roberts stood up and said, "What are y'all thinking? It's 50-50. Our leader had a job to do. He made the best deal he thought he could for the Senate with Tom Daschle. Now let's shut up and go to work." Everybody calmed down, and we went forward. But I talked to Pat Roberts today, by the way. I told him, I said, "Hey, Senator Roberts, I'm in Kansas at the Roberts Institute." He said, "I think you have the wrong institute." He's doing good, by the way. And even more importantly, his wife, Frankie's doing great.
Senator Lott, when you succeeded Senator Dole as majority leader, what happened? Who called who, and what were some of your first conversations about? How did you establish your relationship as majority and minority leader?
Well, the first thing we did, one of the very first things we did is decided that we needed to be able to talk to each other directly. And so we did something that nobody had done before or after, and that was to set up a direct line on our desks and we used, I don't know why we decided on having a red phone, but they were red. And so when that phone rang, I knew there was only one person on the other end of that line, and that was Trent Lott. But that was one of the first decisions we made together, and it really made a difference. His office and mine were about 200 feet apart, so anytime he would walk physically to my office or I'd walk to his, all the press would gather around and you'd have to try to explain what it is you're going to do. So oftentimes it was just easier. Close the door, call the leader, and see if we could work something out. We used that phone a lot.
And it was also one way to get around our own staffs.
Yeah.
Sometime when my staff saw me talking to Daschle, they said, uh-oh, they got another one of these riverboat gamblers deals coming up. And so it was a way we could talk to each other free from the press or even the staff, to talk honestly with each other about what our needs were, what our concerns were, and how we could get things done. And it was amazing how many times we would come to a conclusion of how we could get it done.
Did you face any, and during this time, did you, as a majority and minority leader, did you face any pressure from your constituents to cease working on a bipartisan basis, or were people unhappy that you might be too pragmatic or too interested in finding the common ground? Was that purity an element of your experience?
I didn't really. There was a certain amount of pride. I was the only Mississippian to ever be majority leader. There was a pride, but also, like we talked about talking to each other, I also made it a point not to forget who I was, where I was from. I kept my house in Pascagoula, Mississippi. One of the things I particularly remember is that I voted for a separate Department of Education. I had polled the issue, and my constituents were opposed to that position, 53 to 47, I guess it was. But I was, son of a school teacher. I worked for the University of Mississippi 3 years. I really felt like education was being squeezed by what was then the Department of Health, Education and Welfare was being squeezed by Health and Welfare. I thought we needed to pay more attention to education and maybe try to do a better job of what the federal government should do or should not do in education. But I did one of my quarterly news letters to my constituents, and I explained, here's why I voted the way I did. And I never had a single complaint. The moral of that story is, if you represent the people, tell them what you're doing. But if you're honest with them, usually they'll forgive you. But also, I think their attitude was, and this is what, we are a republic, we're not a democracy. They sent me to Washington to do the due diligence, to study issues, and to work the issues, and to vote for them. And so they gave me a lot of leeway to do what I thought was right. I guess if I'd have voted enough the wrong way, they'd have thrown me out. But I never sensed that kind of feeling from the people of my state, and I'm sure that Bob Dole felt the same about the people of Kansas.
I did a couple of things that I think gave me an opportunity to address those challenges. I made it a goal every year I was in Congress to get to every county in South Dakota. And I took great pride in making sure that even the smallest of counties I got into.
And tell them about that beat-up old car you rode around in.
I had a 71 Pontiac that had 280,000 miles on it. And that's what I used to drive around, and it's now in a car museum in South Dakota. But in August, I would take 2 to 3 weeks without any staff and just drive around and show up and talk to people in businesses and talk to schools and farmers and everything. I could just walk down Main Street, but I'd just show up with no staff, and people seemed to think that was a good idea. And then the other thing I did was I set up the first toll-free line where people could call my office directly, and every so often we'd have what we called Talk to Tom nights, where they could just call and they'd queue up, and I would talk to them for a while and move on to the next caller. So I think, as Trent said, I think the key is to really try to stay in touch with your constituencies and find ways to do that. And Trent did that extremely well, and I tried to do it as well as I could too.
Mm-hmm. We talked about the 50-50 Congress that you both presided over. Do you keep in touch with members of the Senate, or the 50-50 Senate? Do you keep in touch with members of the Senate today and try to encourage them to work more on a bipartisan basis, or maybe you can't say?
No,
Well,
we both do.
Yeah, we do stay in touch with them. Of course, I had the Singing Senators Quartet. You remember that fantabulous singing group? Maybe not. But in my Singing Senators group, we had John Ashcroft from Missouri, who was a great singer, Larry Craig from Idaho, and Jumpin' Jim Jeffords from Vermont, who eventually jumped parties on us, so our quartet fell apart. But I still talk to Phil Graham of Texas, who was, I thought, one of the smartest guys we ever had in the Senate. And so I read Judd Gregg from New Hampshire, another great friend, Lamar Alexander from Tennessee. The point is, I'm making a point to stay in touch. My two best buddies when I was in the Senate on our side of the aisle were Connie Mack from Florida and Dan Coates from Indiana. And so I still stay in touch with them. They're still doing pretty good, although we're all getting a little long in tooth. But you know, so I do reach out to them, and it's always rewarding, the reaction you get, just like calling Pat Roberts today. You know, what a character he is, too. So, but he was always jealous that his wife Frankie was from South Carolina, and us Southerners kind of have a relationship, you know.
Yeah, no, but I think it's important to try to stay in touch every once in a while. In fact, Bob had a great idea that he shared with me. He invited all the former senators to come to a lunch at one point, and it was such a great experience. He said, "Tom, you ought to do that too." And so this was after we both had left the Senate. So I did the same thing as when President Obama was president, and I asked the president if, as a former senator, if he would come and join us, and he did, and it was really a memorable and wonderful time, and I think we should do more of that. But I think your question in part was, do we stay in touch with the current senators and House members, and we both do. I think Trent is on the Hill even more than I am, but we do try to stay in touch with current members as well. I was with Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia a couple nights ago.
So in your interactions with current senators, do you sense any possibility or opportunities for them to compromise on any particular areas of policy?
Well, I think it's harder today. I think the reasons it's harder in part go back to how much media has changed in the last 20 years. Social media, cable news, that has really created, I think, a different dynamic. And as Trent said, we both believe that the airplane is shorthand, really, for the lack of time people spend in Washington today. You know, they literally do leave Thursday nights and come back Tuesday mornings, and we try to run the country on Wednesdays. And you just can't do that, as complicated as things are. And I think just the fundraising chase, too, the last 2 years, senators will spend 2/3 of their time doing nothing but raising money now. You know, it's a breakfast fundraiser, it's a lunch fundraiser, it's a dinner fundraiser, it's a reception fundraiser, and then it's call time in between those fundraisers during the day. So they spend all their time raising money, and I think that undermines one's ability to really work on the legislative process as well.
I still stay in touch with Bill Clinton. I've seen him a couple of times in the last year, and we still have a lot of stories we tell on each other. When I was leader and he was president, I remember one time he called and he was giving me a line of bull. And I said, "Mr. President, you know, I'm from across the creek from you. I grew up about like you. Don't give me that." And so he laughed and he changed his tune. But you know, we had a lot of fun together. One time I called him and I said, "Mr. President, I got a great big favor to ask." He said, "What's that?" I said, "I'd like you to nominate my best friend, my college roommate, my fraternity brother to be a federal judge." He said, "Well, what kind of lawyer is he?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, he's a plaintiff suing lawyer." And he said, "You are recommending a plaintiff lawyer?" Because I was a defense lawyer. I was on the other side. And he says, but I said, "He's the most honorable man I've ever known. He'll do the right thing, whether it's for the plaintiff or defense." He said, "Well, is he a Democrat?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, he's kind of a half-assed Democrat like you and me." He said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "He represents the Board of Supervisors. They're all Democrats. He was elected as an election commissioner in his county, not exactly a high-level position as a Democrat." And he said, "Well, I tell you what, if you get the former governor and the provost of the University of Mississippi to say he's okay, I'll nominate him." They did. He did, and my roommate served as a federal judge for 10 years. And he's, you know, we still, when we get together, there's two, you know, Southern country boys making fun of each other. He's really doing pretty well. You know, he's not as spry as he used to be. But even that is something I think is worthwhile. You know, I didn't agree with him a lot of time, but the man served as president of our country. And we did a lot of good stuff when he was there. In fact, it didn't really start going downhill between the parties until really kind of after he left. It started slipping and sliding, I think, about 2002. So we've had about 20 years of this. But my motto has always been, this too shall pass. The American people will find a way to correct this, and I believe it.
I have just a couple more questions before we open up the floor to our audience to ask their own questions. We talked about, you know, the airplane and the culture of travel that has eroded the relationships in the Senate. Either of you have, what procedurally do you think could be done to change how the Senate works and maybe to encourage more bipartisan interaction and cooperation?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to ensure that we use the committee process the way we used to. I think, you know, the committees are the workshops of the Congress. And we don't use the committees as much anymore. We do what is commonly referred to as top-down legislating, where the president and the leaders will come together and they'll negotiate a deal on something. You know, we're going to see that with the, or hopefully we'll see it with the debt limit sometime in the next couple months, but that's top-down. It used to be bottom-up, where people introduced a bill, it would get into the committee, you'd have a hearing, you'd have even a subcommittee hearing, you'd work through you'd have what is called a markup, where you literally went page by page and marked up the bill, passed it out of committee, took it to the floor. So little legislating occurs at that committee level nowadays, and I think that's really fundamental to restoring the democratic legislative process, is to ensure that, and really committee members would find ways to come together. And that's, if I could do one thing, it would be to restore that committee prominence in legislating again.
I can't improve on that. I certainly agree with that, but and I've seen it really deteriorate over the years, partially because, and I blame my friend Newt Gingrich for this. He started encouraging members, leave your families back home. The most important thing is get reelected. The job is in Washington. You know, I was from Pascagoula, Mississippi, and I kept my house there, but my kids and my family were with me. My kids went to school in Northern Virginia. The job was there. And when I was leader, I used to have bed check votes on Monday to say, hey, we're going to work this week. Most people work, you know, 5 days a week. But I'm afraid that's a little Pollyannish with modern technology and the airplane, getting members to be there 5 days a week, 3 weeks out of the month. It's just, with the social media and iPhones and transportation, it's hard to do that. So the other thing is, other than strong leadership, is to do what Tom has said. Do the groundwork. Do the work at the subcommittee level. I enjoyed that work because that was where I learned the most. When you're having a committee on agriculture or finance and you're discussing the economic policies of your country, it's hard to learn a whole lot from a speech on the floor of the Senate. It's better when you're in that committee, you're hearing expert witnesses, you're actually drafting the legislation line by line, and they've gotten away from that. But it can change pretty quickly. If you have a different set of younger men and women lead this country, did you hear what I just said? There was a real message in what I just said. Younger men and women to lead this country into Congress too. Maybe they will begin to change it and get it headed back in the right direction.
Audrey, I gotta add one more thing.
Go for it.
And this is, you know, we may endanger whether or not C-SPAN continues to cover this program with what I'm about to say. But I think C-SPAN has been a mixed blessing, frankly. I think it's great to have the transparency that C-SPAN has brought to American democracy. We can watch our legislators, and that's great. But too many members now speak to the camera. They don't speak to each other. And when they speak to the camera, they want to say the thing that will probably generate the most news or get the most attention. In the old days, before we had C-SPAN, people really talked to each other more. And Trent and I had an experience when we had to deal with the Clinton impeachment in the 90s. We had a discussion. Do we have it all on C-SPAN, or do we not do some parts? And so we decided we'd have executive sessions at night sometimes. And the contrast between what our members were saying to those cameras during the day, and when we shut the cameras down, what they were saying to each other that night was almost night and day. It was so dramatically different and so honest and so real. And so we don't have as much of that real dialogue anymore because there's too much concern about what the camera's going to catch you saying.
We can snap that part out of the C-SPAN.
Yeah, that's right. That'll be edited out somehow.
I agree with that. Yeah. Right.
Well, so my last question is about electoral politics. And is there anything that you think that the parties can do on their side of things to help ensure that more folks who are interested in running for office, that you elevate more folks who are interested in working on a bipartisan basis? Is there something to be done there?
Programs like the Dole Institute help to get young people that are interested in government to be involved and study it. I have the Trent Lott Leadership Institute at the University of Mississippi. It's a degree granting program in public policy and leadership. I bring 2 of those students each semester to Washington to work as interns in our office, to monitor committee hearings, to cover committee hearings, to go to meetings and receptions. I think by having programs to get them involved and get them interested and educate them as to how they can be good leaders is a very important thing. That's why I'm here. I think this Dole Institute, other than being a tribute to Bob Dole, is about young men and women that we need to think about how do we preserve this great young republic. And I think you can make a difference in their lives. I believe in mentoring young people too. My successor in the Senate is Roger Wicker. He's been chairman of the Commerce Committee. He's now a senior Republican on Armed Services. When he got out of the Air Force JAG program, I called him. He had been president of the student body at my alma mater and a fraternity brother, so I called him and said, "What are you going to be doing? What kind of job?" He said, "I don't have one." He came to work for me in the House as my counsel on the Rules Committee, and now he's a senior senator. I had a policy director named Chip Pickering, whose father was a federal judge. He worked for me as a staff member, but became a congressman, and probably should be a senator today. But I do think it's incumbent on the leaders to find young future leaders and help mentor them so that when our day is done, they'll pick up the mantle and carry on.
I can't improve on what Trent just said about mentorship and the importance of institutes like this. I have one in South Dakota State as well, and I just think there's so much value in trying to encourage young people. But Audrey, if I could, I would add one thing totally in a different context, but I worry a lot about primary and general elections these days and how much more dominant primary elections are in the selection of our leaders than the general election oftentimes. And because primaries are becoming the dominant way we select our leaders, it's the small base, because there's only about a 20 or 25% turnout of voters on primaries, and it's usually the hardcore bases on the Republican and Democratic side. Well, if that's who you have to respond to, you don't have to respond to all those people who want to be swing voters in the middle in the general election. And somehow I think we've got to work and try to figure out a way to bring that general election back to the prominence and importance that it deserves, so that people do feel more comfortable coming to the middle and compromising once they've staked out their strong positions on either side.
Mm-hmm.
One of the points on that, I think that's really an important point. When I was a whip in the House, I had 40 to 50 Democrats that I could count on, even though I was always in the minority. We had what we called in those days boll-weevil Democrats. They were conservative Democrats, mostly from the South. I accused them of becoming cicadas and going underground. And then they came back out as blue dogs. But the point is, there was a strong center in the House in those days.
Yeah.
You had some moderate Republicans, and you had a lot of conservative Democrats. Then when I moved over to the Senate and became whip and majority leader, my biggest concern was my moderate to liberal Republicans, like the ladies from Maine, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, who's a great senator and is now the senior Republican on the Appropriations Committee, and Judd Gregg, the New Englanders. I always had to worry about the New Englanders. But there was a center on both sides.
Yeah.
Now the center has evaporated. You know how many blue dogs are left in the House? It's maybe 7 conservative Democrats. And you know how many moderate New England Republicans are left in the Senate? 1. So the parties have pulled apart. And, you know, I never camped in the center. I was right of center. Tom was a little left of center. But we didn't fight over what position we were in. We tried to agree on where the sweet spot was. And usually it was between the two of us. So we've got to figure out how we deal with this, the polarization, to try to get people. You can disagree philosophically. We don't agree on a lot of things, but we weren't disagreeable about it. One of my favorite quotes was from former Congressman Jack Kemp of Buffalo, New York. His motto was, "I'm conservative Republican, but I ain't mad about it." So be a happy Republican or a happy Democrat. And it's amazing what you can get done. You might even sing together like Elvira.
Maybe at the end of Q&A, we'll come back to that. All right, folks, I know you all have some really great questions out there. Please raise your hand and a student with a microphone will come to you. And you can ask a brief question. Catherine, right here.
I would like to thank both of you for spending some of your time with us here today. And I'd also be interested in knowing how each of you feels about the filibuster and why.
Well, the filibuster, as you know, has been a part of the Senate since its creation. And it was almost accidental. Aaron Burr was the one who, by his dictate as President pro tem of the Senate, or actually President of the Senate, he was the Vice President at the time, ruled about unlimited debate, and they respected that rule until 1917. 1917, Woodrow Wilson, who had earlier, when in his college years, had written in opposition to the, or in favor of the filibuster, proposed a new rule in the Senate we called cloture, that if you got a certain overwhelming majority, at that time it was 67 senators, to stop the filibuster, you could do that and move to final passage on a bill. Well, that cloture motion was in place and has been in place now, but it's been eroded over time. But in the first 50 years, we had 47 filibusters, that's all, 47 cloture votes. In the last couple of years, we've had 337 cloture votes. So it tells you how broken the whole system is, because you don't, in the old days, you had to hold the floor, you had to stay 24 hours a day, it was painful to go through a filibuster. You don't have to do any of that anymore. In the early 1970s, we also changed the way we passed budgets. You couldn't filibuster a budget, and so they have something called reconciliation, which gives you an opportunity in the budget process to vote without a filibuster. And now we try to jam all the legislation we possibly can into this so-called reconciliation measure to avoid the filibuster. But the real problem we have with filibusters now is that it's painless. All someone has to do is say, I'm going to put a hold on that bill, and it's viewed as the equivalent of a filibuster, and it takes days and days to go through the process to overcome that hold. We've dropped the threshold from 67 to 60, but it's still, because all of the time it takes, that hold is the equivalent of a filibuster, and so we've got all these cloture votes now that we have to go through. So in answer to your question, I'm giving you a filibuster as an answer, which I didn't mean to do, but what I would like to see is not to get rid of the filibuster, but to go back to the old rules, where you had maybe one a year. we can live with that. What it does require, 60 votes requires you to work together. And if you didn't have that, you know, it would be just like the House, where the majority dictates everything.
Like everything else, I think part of the reason why you have so many of them now is because the leaders allow it. You know, I used to sometimes go to one of my Republican colleagues that was filibustering a bill and said, "What are you doing?" And one time, one of my somebody had a hold, one of the things that Tom mentioned on a bill. So I went over to the Democratic cloakroom and said, "Who's got a hold on this bill?" And they said, "Not us, it's your guys." Oh, okay. So I go to the Republican side. I go back to the cloakroom. "Who's got a hold on this bill?" Silence. "Who's got a hold on this bill? I got to know so we can move this legislation." "You do, Senator." My staff had put a hold on that bill without my knowledge. So guess what I had to say to that staff member? But there's a reason for the filibuster. I think there's no question it's been abused. One of the things, Tom and I tried to shape it up a little bit by requiring getting members, if you put a hold on a bill, you had to identify yourself. I believe and I've always been an advocate. One of the things that delays the process is you can filibuster the motion to proceed. In other words, you can filibuster because you don't even want to debate the bill. You know, in the United States Senate, you're not willing to at least debate it. So there's it's like everything. It could be modified some. I think there's a uniqueness about it for the Senate, which we need to keep, but we need to see if we can find a way to keep it from just tying the Senate in knots where they can't get anything done. But by the way, last year they passed not one, not two, but 3 major pieces of legislation on a bipartisan vote. Now, a lot of my Republican friends think, yeah, at least 2 of those were stupid too. But they got it done. Infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a fraud, but there were some reasons to vote for those bills, and we just need to make sure the filibuster is dealt with more reasonably going forward.
Great, thank you. I think let's go back to Michael.
Hi, thanks again for both of you for coming here today. Almost 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now, BICRA bipartisan campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold passed. I believe we have a yay and a nay with us. Do you feel the same way you did when you voted on bipartisan campaign finance reform today, and specifically when it comes to limits on party fundraising? Thank you.
The last part, I couldn't understand you. Particularly what?
Particularly when it comes to limits on party fundraising and party spending.
Well, I've always believed that we've got to find a way to end the money chase. I mean, in my last race, the total amount that was spent in my campaign, the last race, was $55 million, and that's a drop in the bucket this to what was spent.
You could have bought the whole state for that.
Exactly. But I mean, in Georgia, in the last cycle, in Georgia alone, they spent over $1 billion.
With a B?
With a B, that's the governor and the 2 Senate races together. But over $1 billion in Georgia alone. This is going to continue to get worse unless we figure out a way. I'd start by saying you can't raise money while you're in session. But you've got First Amendment issues, and you've got all these different problems that prevent us from really reaching consensus. You're asking about reaching consensus. Well, that's always been a hard issue for Republicans and Democrats to reach consensus around. But I got to say, it's really getting to be serious. And I also, frankly, I worry some about quid pro quoism. You vote, you get access. You vote, you get reaction. And it's becoming murkier and murkier, and that troubles me as well. I wish I had a solution. It was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision when it was made initially, and it'd be nice if we could go back to the court someday, but I just don't see a short-term resolution right now.
I could probably do a dissertation on this subject, but I spent years fighting John McCain and Russ Feingold on the campaign finance reform. I thought what they were advocating was going to be a mistake. I think in a lot of ways it was a mistake. I'm really worried now about dark money, and I remember one time I was in my state, and I was at a football game. I was at the motel, and all of a sudden a campaign spot came on, and it was about me. It was for me, but I didn't do it. I didn't know who had done it, and yet there's a TV spot about my candidacy on TV. I don't like that. Even if this one, it turned out it was from the Automobile Dealers Association doing a positive ad. But the fact that they can do the negative, they can do the positive. I don't like dark money. I think people should have to reveal who they are. I think they should have to do it in a timely way. I think Republicans better sober up and figure out why we're getting wiped out by small contributions. We really got outspent in the elections last year by a large number. And I've met with Republican leaders saying, we better figure out what's going on here. And it's not just huge million-dollar contributions. You're talking about a lot of small contributions that come through the social media, what do you call it, the blue something now?
Act Blue.
Act Blue. They're doing a great job. But I do think the money chase is really getting to be a problem. I don't advocate public financing for campaigns, but I do think we're getting to the point where we need to take a look at the honesty of it, who's doing it, how it's being done, and try to make sure that it's at least a reasonable and an honest procedure.
All right, next question here, about up here in the front.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure and honor to hear your speech. And I'm the first generation naturalized American citizen and love this country as much as everybody else, if not more so, and equally concerned about the division and tribalization of politics as everybody else. But there's another thing that's even more alarming from my point of view is that among all these partisans and bickerings, and there are 435 votes in the House. In the last 2 months, at least 3 legislation passed with some 400 to 0. And coming from a country where everything votes 5,000 to 0, it's scary. So my question is, any comments that we can move this to 400 to 1?
I can't imagine what it was. Motherhood?
No, it's balloon, COVID, and something else.
Oh, yeah. Oh. I don't know.
That's a good question.
It makes you suspicious, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Well, you don't see many votes like that. Unfortunately, in the House, it's going to be more often, it'll be something like 218 to 213. In fact, tomorrow, there will probably be a vote in the House of Representatives on the debt ceiling and the budget issue. And if Speaker McCarthy is lucky, he'll get 218 votes. But he may not. But then what? If he wins or he loses, what happens? And then the Senate, if they do pass it, the Senate's not going to take it up. So what's going to happen? Tom and I agree on this, and we don't mean it as a criticism. It's a hope and a wish. The president needs to sit down with McCarthy and with Schumer and McConnell and see if we can't work some of this out. Give a little to get a little. When we made the balanced budget deal with Bill Clinton, believe you me, he wanted more than I wanted to give him. He gave too much, in Tom's opinion, but we kept hammering away. In fact, the morning we reached the deal, at 10:30, he called me on a Friday morning and said, can you add $10 billion more to these programs? And I said, no, Mr. President. Pete Domenici, the budget chairman from the Senate, and John Kasich, the budget committee chairman from the House, are in my outer office, and they say, not another nickel. We gotta, as you would understand, being from Arkansas, we gotta fish or cut bait, Mr. President. What's it gonna be? So he didn't appreciate it, and he was pretty mad. So I sat there the rest of the day waiting to see what was gonna happen, and at 4:30, Erskine Bowles, his chief of staff, called and said, okay, we have a deal. It took months. It wasn't easy, but we got it done. And that's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah, there's no reason to wait, especially on this big issue around the debt limit now. We really ought to get started. There's no reason why I can't start tomorrow. Let's start negotiating. Let's try to figure out how we're going to get a path to to the end of the goal here, and because the calamity that would occur if we missed that deadline would just be disastrous. They know that. We shouldn't have to wait until midnight for it to occur.
By the
Let's
way,
get it done.
I'm glad you're in America. We're glad to have you.
Absolutely.
We need more like it.
going to Georgetown to study politics.
Oh, really?
Oh, fantastic.
Well, maybe we'll see you around town.
All right, other questions?
I see a hand back there.
Yeah, there's quite a few back here, yeah.
So one of the things that's happening sort of globally right now is the world is starting to look more and more dangerous. So a lot of our allies in Europe and Asia are starting to spend more on defense. In your experience, do dangerous times tend to bring more bipartisan cooperation, have no effect, or drive people apart?
That's a great question. I actually, the one area where I am a little more optimistic on is foreign policy right now. I mean, we've seen it with Ukraine, overwhelming votes on supporting Ukraine's effort, Republicans and Democrats coming together. You know, we see it with regard to our position vis-a-vis Russia and China. In fact, there's almost a contest between the two parties on who can be tougher on China these days. And so I think to a certain extent there is a good deal of support there that I think is really so necessary. We've got to ensure that we don't do things alone, that we really do engage our allies and make it a collective and collaborative effort. And I think in the last few years we've been doing a little better job of that. The one area where we're not doing a good job, in my opinion, at all is trade. I wish we could. Trent and I have talked about that a lot. We've got to figure out ways to ensure that we can trade with the rest of the world, and we've got to be engaged in trade policy that accommodates our need for trade. And I don't think we still are there yet on either side, on either Democratic or Republican policy as it relates to trade. But generally, I feel a little more optimistic about the bipartisan commitment to engaging with our allies on international affairs.
You know, fear is a very sobering emotion. And like on your question, well, talking about the debt ceiling, I can't understand why they're messing around with this, because I fear the financial ramifications of not having a debt ceiling. We've had a couple of government shutdowns, and they were dumb when we did it. We paid a price. So I think, you know, we need to act on that. But also on this question back here, I do think that we need to be paying attention to what the rest of the world is doing. I don't think we're doing what we should be doing on defense. The Chinese now have 335 naval vessels. We have, I think, 300. And we're retiring vessels, and they're building vessels. Now, ships are about more than numbers, but numbers can overwhelm you, even if you have a superior capability. I think we better start paying some more attention to the situation vis-a-vis Russia and China. I think we need to take a really serious look at our defense budget, but that's where I'm going to give you some good news. I thought that the president's budget, quite frankly, was totally inadequate in the defense area. Here's the good news of this, though. The Republican and Democrat leader of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate and in the House worked together. Every year for 50 years, we have passed without fail the NDAA, the National Defense Act. And they'll do it again this year. And they're working on it now. So there is the good news, that you will have the leaders of the two parties in the House and the Senate. And I think the appropriations, by the way, ladies, for the first time in history, the top women, the top members of the Appropriations Committee, Democrat, Republican, House and Senate, are all women. And they're good. I think they're going to get the job done. I was talking to Susan Collins from Maine recently, and I said, how are you going to get this done? And she said, starting in June, we're going to take up the bills one by one. That's the way you do it. You just start taking them up, you stick with it till you get them done. I think that they may get the appropriations bills done this year instead of one of these huge omnibus bills or continuing resolutions, just continuing at the current level, which is very dangerous. So there is good news out there. But I do think we need to get all of our military leaders, the Pentagon, the Congress to sit down and assess where we're spending money for the military. I think we've got some aircraft we don't need. We got some ships we don't need. We've got these so-called littoral combat ships, where basically a flat-bottom ship that we should never have bought. But if you retire them, you better replace them with something better. That is a very important thing for the status of the world, and I hope the Congress will pay close attention to it, and I hope the President will engage them in that area.
Just to take the comments that Trent said on women one step further, first of all, Patty Murray and Susan Collins are two of the most respected senators today in the Senate, and both deserve the respect and admiration that they both have earned. But Patty Murray is now the first woman President Pro Tem. The highest ranking position in the Senate is President Pro Tem. And for the first time in history, it's a woman, and it's Patty Murray. So women there are, I think, 25 women now in the Senate.
Wow.
So we've come a long way.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question. I see one right here. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for taking our questions. You both spoke earlier to the camaraderie that was built when you were able to spend, 4 or 5 whole days at work. It seems like a lot of members nowadays want to be seen in their district at home. How do you think you can reverse that trend, or if we need to? It's a lot to ask members of Congress to move their whole family if it's only for a couple years, but it seems like what you're losing is the camaraderie, and you're leaving a lot of work to your staff that may or may not be doing things that you're knowing about, as you mentioned. So what do you think about switching that up a little bit?
Think about switching what?
Getting more members to come and spend more time in DC, maybe even with their families, versus being seen in their districts more. Because it seems like a lot of members want to be seen in their districts a lot more and want to say, my kids go to school there and I have a business, want to be seen in their district versus spending too much time in DC.
Well, it is going to be hard to turn things around. The old days are going to be hard to bring back. I'm pretty sure I know it's well over 100 members now sleep in their offices, which is a form of public housing I've never supported. But part of it is political, but part of it is economic too.
Yeah.
This will probably be something some of you disagree with, but I think the economics around political life these days gets harder and harder. When they haven't had a pay raise in a long time, and it's hard to justify to your constituents that you voted for a pay raise. But the fact of the matter is that when you've got to go back and forth, and you've got families, and you want to move your family to Washington or make more of your presence in Washington, there's an economic question involved here too, and I don't think we have fully acknowledged that or dealt with it because of the politics around pay raises and what salaries are generated by members of Congress.
I don't know if I can add a whole lot to that. Just one small thing that would help the members on that issue is these members that do go to Washington, they have to stay in a hotel or an apartment building. That comes out of their pocket. A businessman or woman that does that, you get to deduct that expense. We don't allow Congress to do that. That would be one way we could help and face the realities of the way they have to live without raising the salary even. But that's one example of for every problem, there is a solution if you look for it. And I do think now I was able to maintain a small house in Northern Virginia and my house in Pascagoula. I'm not sure I could do that today. And that's why some of these members are sleeping in their offices. If I were there, I would do everything I could to have a rule that would prohibit that practice. I don't think it's sanitary and just a really bad idea. But it's one of many problems that, we need to deal with. And I want to tell you this, too. I have frustration with some of the current top leaders in the Congress who shall remain nameless, and I'll just say all of them. When I look down the line at the next generation that's coming along, I have hope. You know, that on the Republican side in the Senate, we've got a number of really talented young men and women that are coming along. John Barrasso of Wyoming, John Cornyn of Texas, John Thune of South Dakota, and their leadership styles are different from the ones that are in the leadership now. That may not necessarily be good, but at least it'll be different.
Senator Lott, Senator Daschle, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us for the 2023 Dole Lecture. This is the finale of our programming season, so we're so glad you joined us for this wonderful occasion, and watch for news in the coming weeks about our landmark celebration this summer as we commemorate Senator Bob Dole's 100th birthday and the 20th anniversary of the dedication of the Dole Institute. So we look forward to seeing you this summer, and have a great evening.
Great job.